The year 1979 did not just change a government. It severed a bridge that had stood for decades. In a matter of weeks, the familiar channels of communication went cold. Embassies shuttered their doors, flags were lowered, and the decades of cooperation that defined the previous era evaporated into the desert heat. What replaced it was not merely a disagreement, but a profound and sudden estrangement that fundamentally altered the geopolitical map. The shockwaves were immediate. Where there had once been strategic alignment, there was now a wall of silence and suspicion. Every diplomatic protocol, every established line of contact, and every shared interest was discarded in the wake of the revolution. This was the moment the trajectory of two nations diverged, setting the stage for a cycle of tension that would define the next half-century. By the time the dust settled, the distance between the two capitals had become an unbridgeable chasm, and the era of estrangement had officially begun. The silence of the late 70s did not last long. By the dawn of the next decade, the regional landscape shifted into a state of active, grinding conflict. The Iran-Iraq War erupted, and with it, the geopolitical divide deepened into a trench. Both nations found themselves locked on opposing sides of a strategic map, their interests colliding in the dust of the front lines. It was no longer just a matter of severed ties. It was a matter of competing agendas. The United States moved to secure its regional influence, while Iran sought to project its own power across the borders. Every tactical maneuver in the desert became a signal of intent. The war acted as a catalyst, hardening the estrangement into a permanent fixture of international relations. Where there had been a void, there was now a constant, low-level hum of friction. Alliances were tested, borders became flashpoints, and the distance between the two capitals grew wider. By the time the smoke cleared, the new reality was undeniable. The era of simple estrangement had evolved into a complex, multi-layered rivalry. The region had been transformed, and the path back to the old order was effectively closed. As the new millennium dawned, the theater of conflict moved from the battlefield to the laboratory. The focus shifted sharply toward Iran's nuclear program, transforming regional friction into a global crisis. International alarm grew with every report of enrichment, and the narrative of the relationship entered a high-stakes phase. The United States led a coalition demanding transparency, while Iran asserted its right to civilian energy, creating a deadlock. The response was a systematic tightening of the economic noose. A series of escalating sanctions were deployed. These were blunt instruments of statecraft that crippled regional trade and severed financial lifelines. Shipping lanes slowed, currency markets buckled, and the cost of basic imports surged for the civilian population. By the end of the decade, the cycle of pressure was fully entrenched, leaving the global community to watch. By 2015, the relentless cycle of pressure hit a sudden, unexpected pause. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action emerged as a landmark attempt to rewrite the rules of engagement. Diplomats gathered, pens hit paper, and for a fleeting moment the path toward transparency seemed clear. The agreement promised a tangible exchange. Strict limits on enrichment activities in return for the lifting of suffocating economic sanctions. For a short window, the tension that had defined the previous decade began to dissipate. Trade routes reopened, and the global markets responded with a cautious optimism. But this stability was fragile. In 2018, the United States executed a sharp, unilateral withdrawal from the deal, effectively tearing the framework apart. The shift was instantaneous. The relief that had been painstakingly negotiated vanished, and the status quo was reset to a state of heightened hostility. The cycle of economic pressure surged back with renewed force, and the diplomatic bridge that had taken years to build was dismantled in a single policy announcement. The hope for a lasting resolution evaporated, replaced by a return to the familiar, grinding friction of the past. The withdrawal did not just end a treaty, it signaled the total collapse. The collapse of the agreement left a vacuum that was quickly filled by kinetic, localized friction. The theater of conflict expanded beyond the negotiating table and into the volatile waters of the Persian Gulf. Tankers slowed in the narrow straits, shadowed by patrol boats, while the constant hum of military surveillance drones became a permanent feature of the skyline. Every maritime movement turned into a high-stakes standoff, where a single miscalculation threatened to ignite a broader conflict. Simultaneously, the shadow war intensified across Syria and Iraq. Proxy groups mobilized with increased frequency, launching strikes against strategic outposts and logistical hubs. These were not random acts. They were precise, calculated maneuvers. The air in these zones grew heavy with the threat of an imminent spark. Every embassy-related tension added to the mounting pressure. The situation became a volatile game of brinkmanship, where the line between a localized skirmish and a full-scale regional crisis blurred. The Shadow War reached a point of no return when the focus shifted from proxies to the targeted removal of key figures. These were not merely tactical strikes. They were calculated, high-consequence maneuvers that stripped away the veneer of deniability. When the news broke, the global reaction was instantaneous. Markets shuddered, and diplomatic channels went silent as the world held its breath. The threshold of conflict had been crossed. In the corridors of power, the rhetoric hardened into an ultimatum. Military assets across the region moved into high-readiness postures, shifting from surveillance to active, aggressive positioning. The distance between a localized operation and a full-scale direct confrontation vanished in a matter of hours. Every movement was interpreted as a prelude to total war. The atmosphere became suffocatingly tense. Both nations stood on the razor-thin edge of an irreversible decision. The situation had moved beyond the control of mediators, descending into a terrifying, high-stakes standoff that pushed the entire international order to the absolute brink of collapse. Beneath the immediate threat of kinetic war, the nuclear question remained the primary engine of the crisis. Iran accelerated its enrichment activities, spinning centrifuges at higher speeds and increasing stockpiles with deliberate, measurable progress. Each percentage point of purity gained was a signal of defiance, a physical assertion of sovereign right to energy development. In response, the United States tightened the economic vice. Sanctions were not just policy documents. They were concrete barriers that choked trade, froze assets, and severed the financial arteries of the state. The clash was absolute. The standoff became a rigid, uncompromising loop. For every new centrifuge brought online, a new layer of economic restriction was applied. It was a high-stakes race against the clock, where the demand for security collided head-on with the pursuit of national power. The nuclear file was no longer just a diplomatic challenge. It was the central, unyielding axis upon which the entire regional stability turned. The friction between the two nations extends far beyond the nuclear file, manifesting in a complex web of regional influence. Iran projects its power through a diverse array of political and military networks, embedding itself into the local dynamics of neighboring states. These networks act as a counterweight to the strategic alliances the United States has cultivated over decades. The result is a volatile landscape, where the two powers are constantly maneuvering for position. Every political shift and every movement is calculated. This is a chess game played across borders, where the pieces are regional stability and the stakes are the control of key transit corridors. The danger lies in the lack of clear boundaries. A localized incident, such as a skirmish near a border, no longer remains isolated. Because these networks are integrated, a single spark can trigger a cascading response, pulling broader alliances into the fray. The entire region functions as a pressure cooker, where the competing security architectures collide, leaving little room for error. Despite the persistent risk of escalation, the relationship is not entirely devoid of safety mechanisms. Back-channel communications operate in the shadows, serving as essential conduits to prevent minor friction from spiraling into direct conflict. Multilateral mediation efforts provide a secondary layer of stability, acting as a buffer when direct dialogue stalls. These channels remain the primary defense against the catastrophic miscalculations that haunt such a volatile geopolitical landscape. For those observing these developments, the path to understanding requires a disciplined approach to information. Speculation often fills the void left by silence, but clarity is found only in primary sources. Official statements issued by the United States State Department and Iran's Foreign Ministry provide the most accurate record of shifting policy positions. Technical data, particularly the detailed monitoring reports from the IAEA, remains the only reliable metric for assessing the status of the nuclear file. International news organizations serve as the front line for real-time reporting on regional security incidents. The most effective way to navigate this complexity is to cross-reference these official documents with rigorous analysis from established think tanks. By verifying information through multiple credible channels, one can strip away the noise of partisan commentary.